Hello, and welcome back to Spectacular Specimens. My name is Dr. Katherine O'Brien, and I work for the Museum of Biological Diversity. Each week, we team up with my friends from the Grandview Heights Public Library to show you a specimen from our collection and paired with books from the library. To check out the books, look in the links in the description below this video. This week, we're going to be talking to Dr. Lisle Gibbs about an animal that's very close to his heart, snakes.
Well, hello, my name's Dr. Lisle Gibbs. I'm a professor of evolution, ecology, and organismal biology at Ohio State, and I want to tell you a little bit about snakes. But before I do that, I just sort of talk a little bit about how I got interested in snakes. So I've always wanted to be a biologist. I come from a family of biologists. My very first job that I had when I was much younger, here's a picture of me when I was 17 years old, was actually working on birds, not snakes. So these birds were species like this tree swallow. They nested in boxes. But one of the cool things that would happen is every now and then when I would be checking nest boxes for young, I would find one of these guys. I would find a big, large black rat snake that had climbed into the box and was in the process of eating all the babies. And I thought, man, that's cool. I would really like to study these snakes. But it took some time before I actually got around to doing that. And in the meantime, I worked on other species of birds. And in particular, I worked on some birds that live in the Galapagos Islands called Darwin's finches. And they live on this very tiny island of Isla Daphne Major. You can sort of walk around the top of this island in about 10 minutes. And I lived on that island for about 3 years with one other person studying these finches. And you can read all about that work and other stuff that was done on these birds in a book called The Beak of the Finch by Jonathan Weiner, if you're interested. But now I've been at Ohio State for quite some time now, about 20 years. I have a lab of very smart people that work with me. So there's me, but these people, my students and technicians, are the ones that actually do all the interesting work. So what are some cool things about snakes that I'd like to tell you about? In particular, what is a snake? Well, a snake is one of a kind of vertebrate organism. We call them tetrapods. These have 4 limbs. Usually they're feet and legs, but they can be 4 legs as well. And snakes, when we sort of build a family tree of how snakes are related to some other tetrapods, including us, mammals, what we find is that when we build this family tree, that snakes are in fact more closely related to birds and also some other crocodiles than they are in fact to us. But we, along with snakes, are more closely related to one another than we are to amphibians, things like frogs and salamanders. Okay. So one question that people wonder about, lizards have legs, why don't snakes have any legs? Well, in fact, snakes do have legs. You just can't see them. So if we put on our X-ray vision glasses and we look at the bone structure of, say, a human being or any sort of a primate and snakes, what you find is the remarkable result that all the bones that are present in us, our pelvic bones, our thigh bones, are all present in snakes. They've just been reduced in size to very small sort of structures such that you can't actually see them. And they don't actually project outside the snake's body, but they're all there. But the other remarkable thing is that we actually climb into the evolutionary time machine, which is what I like to call the fossil record. We can actually find fossils of things that are recognizably snakes that actually have fairly large legs. And so this is a fossil, I think it's actually from South America. And this is a snake, but it has some pretty big legs. And so what has happened is over time that basically natural selection has operated to basically reduce these to where we see no legs in modern snakes. How do snakes eat? Well, in a word, very slowly. So snakes are remarkable, and I'm sure all of you have seen pictures like this before, in terms of the size of the meal that they can eat. Now, there is this myth that the way snakes basically create a large enough mouth cavity that they can haul in this large prey item like this. This is actually introduced Burmese python eating an alligator in the Everglades, is that they actually can unhinge their jaws. Well, that's not actually true. But what they do is even cooler. So if you take your finger and you put it up to your chin right here, I have a little cleft that identifies this. This basically defines a sort of part of your lower jaw where two pieces of bone that form your left and right parts of your lower jaw have fused together to form a single lower jaw. The same thing has happened to your upper jaw. And this creates your teeth, which you use when you eat your hamburger. What snakes have done is over time, they have actually disconnected the lower parts of the jaw so that the right and left are independent of one another. They're not connected with one another. And the upper parts, the right and left parts of the jaw, are also disconnected with one another. And so how this python is actually going to eat this alligator over time is that essentially it's going to use the fact that its upper right jaw and its upper lower left jaw are independent, and it's going to slowly walk its jaws down over the alligator. And the bottom jaws are going to do the same thing. So they slowly walk the two jaws down the alligator. And over time, this basically allows the python, in this case, to eat a very large meal like the alligator. Pretty cool. So I work on venomous snakes. I'm very interested in studying the evolution of venom. But what is venom? But if you actually take a sample of venom, what is venom? If you actually take a sample of venom and then you separate it out using a very special machine called an HPLC, what you find is that an individual venom sample that's produced by an individual snake consists of all sorts of different proteins, maybe up to 40 different proteins. And these proteins are all present in very different amounts. And so one of the great mysteries that I'm trying to study using genetics, using physiological methods, using biochemical methods, is why all this variation is there. Why are there 40 proteins and not just 4 or 1? And how do they evolve? How does the snake actually produce these proteins? And to do this, one of the things we're doing is actually sequencing the whole genomes of lots of different snakes. How do we actually collect this venom? Well, again, to use one word, very carefully. And so the most commonly sort of known kind of venomous snake are these, they're called front-fanged pit vipers. This is a classic, this is a Western diamondback rattlesnake, and they have these big spectacular mouths, which have these big fangs, which are hollow. These fangs are connected to a venom gland, which is here. And basically, when a snake bites into a prey, it strikes a prey, it basically uses muscles around the venom gland to squeeze the venom gland, and then the venom comes out. So one way actually to think about venom is actually it's just snake spit, but it's been modified quite a bit from, say, the spit that we have. But essentially, it's spit, and a venom gland is essentially the same thing as a salivary gland, the gland in our bodies that produces the spit that comes out in our mouths when we're salivating over that delicious hamburger that we're about to eat. So how do we collect this venom? Well, we very carefully catch a snake with our tongs. We put it into a tube that allows us to control the snake very carefully. We then very carefully back the snake out of the tube so that its mouth is just out for a very brief period of time. And then we get the snake to actually bite the top of a beaker, which has a thin plastic film on it. And when it does this, it will inject its venom. And so here actually is the venom injected by this snake into the bottom of the beaker. We then release the snake carefully, and then we use a micropipetter to collect this, and we put it into our freezers to study it in the future. What's cool though also is that although those pit vipers with their big impressive fangs are sort of what we always associate with venom, there are actually many more snakes that have a very different arrangement for their fangs. And in particular, there are things like this hognose snake, which is something you find actually fairly commonly in the West and maybe in southern United States, which have what are called rear fangs. So these are little nubs that are situated in the back of their mouths. They just project out of the roof of the mouths. But these two are also connected to venom glands that these snakes have. And what I think the idea is that these snakes, when they latch onto a prey, the venom just slowly trickles out of these glands. But essentially it's working in the same way as the big impressive pit vipers in that it's slowly killing the prey and maybe digesting it before the snake will actually eat it. And some of these rear fang snakes are really, really small. So for example, this is a coach whip snake, a snake you would find in the West. And it's so small, it's probably only about like this big, that to actually milk it, it's a rear fang snake, to actually milk the venom out of it, you have to use a binocular microscope. And here's a scientist at the University of Clemson, at Clemson University, Eric Hoffman, who's basically doing this, using a microscope to actually collect venom from this coach whip. Now, Eric is part of a group, again, I mentioned this, of scientists, both in Brazil and the United States, who are all gathered together to study the evolution and the function of venom. And here we all are together talking about our results. There's some Brazilians, Australians, Americans, Canadians, that's me. And we have these meetings every year. Do we have venomous snakes in Ohio? Yes, we are blessed to have 3 species, but they're very rare. And you would be a very lucky person if you actually saw one. So one is the Eastern Massasauga rattlesnake. This is a small rattlesnake. There are basically 2 kinds of rattlesnakes. They're the big rattlesnakes that you all know, the diamondbacks with the big fangs and all the rest of it. But then there are a small number of species that come from another group called the pygmy rattlesnakes, the Massasauga rattlesnakes. We actually also have 2 other species of snake, venomous snakes. These are found mainly in southern Ohio, right basically on the border with Kentucky, West Virginia, and Ohio, down in Appalachia. So one of these is a very impressive timber rattlesnake, Crotalus horridus. These can be very, very large snakes. And these are snakes that you really need to treat with a great deal of respect because they're big and they can inject a lot of venom if they're in fact stimulated to do so. But they are very, very rare. Actually, they're also they're hard to see. And finally, there's also copperheads. This is another kind of a pit viper. It's a little more common than the timber rattlesnakes, but it's also found in Ohio. One of the best places to see these is actually in Shawnee State Park in southern Ohio. Yes, you should absolutely care about snakes. You should care about snakes for practical reasons. Snakes are really important parts of their animal communities. They're predators that control rat populations, do other sorts of useful things in the sort of web of life, if you will. But the main reason why I think you should care about snakes is they're just really cool animals. The other thing I'd emphasize is that even these big rattlesnakes, they are very scared of you whenever you encounter them in nature. And so there are very, very few snakes. I can only think of one, which is known to be aggressive in humans, and those are the black mambas in Africa. But every other snake is probably much more scared of you when you encounter it than you are of it. And I always like to think of this as the Godzilla effect, or the King Kong effect. I mean, think of if King Kong or Godzilla showed up in your backyard while you were watching TV. You'd be pretty terrified because of the difference in sizes. Well, it's the same thing with snakes. So bottom line, you respect snakes, and they will respect you.
Thanks, Lisle. And thanks to all of your friends and coworkers who make this work possible. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up and make sure to also subscribe so you don't miss anything else that's produced by the wonderful Grandview Heights Public Library.